we are live.
Okay, great. Hi, my name is Stephen Blank. I'm the editor and publisher of Slate Media, and I'd like to welcome all of you to our discussion with Robert Zimmerman, the founder and co-president of ZE Creative, a Great Neck-based marketing communications agency. He is also a longtime National Democratic committeeman and a frequent guest on cable news programs. Robert is now running for New York's 3rd Congressional District as a Democrat, and he is helping Slate Media with its series of talks with candidates in that congressional race. So let me kick it off and welcome you again, Robert.
Thank you, Steve. And thanks to you and Slate Media and Northwell for providing us this opportunity. I think it's a great way for candidates to discuss the issues, for you to raise awareness of the issues in this very important election for an open congressional seat. So I really think it's a great opportunity. So thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you for giving Northwell its due as a sponsor here, which I omitted. So let me start it off. And why are you running for Congress?
That's where it all begins. You know, it's a great question, and it really speaks to my commitment to what I think are the defining issues we're facing as a nation. And that is, my political activism really grew out of growing up here on Long Island as a closeted gay kid in suburbia in the 70s. That was a very isolating, lonely experience. But also, it was very empowering to me because out of that sense of isolation growing up as a kid, I found my voice in political activism and political engagement, political energy, and brought me to protest lines and picket lines. It brought me out knocking on door to door for different causes, brought me to my congressman's office, Lester Wolf, when I was an intern, and then grew to be a senior member of his staff. And my point is, the political activism I felt there was driven by standing up for people who felt unseen and unheard in our society, who felt left out, and brought me to work with many veterans in need of mental health care and job training with senior citizens. And the same kind of dynamic that brought me to Capitol Hill, standing up for people who felt unseen and unheard in our society, in our country, is very much what I'm seeing today. As we try to emerge from this pandemic, so many families trying to restart their lives, focusing on the mental health of their children, their job security, their economic safety. This is an important time to stand up for these families, for working people. And it's an important time to stand up for our democracy. I think our democracy is facing its greatest threat since the Civil War. Just think about it. In the first 3 months of this year, Steve, the first 3 months of this year, there are over 250 pieces of legislation introduced in state governments to take away the right to vote or compromise the right of voters and give state governments the right to overturn that vote as an aftermath of the Trump legacy. There are 240 bills introduced in state legislatures to compromise the rights of gay Americans, the LGBTQ plus community, take away their rights to marry, have job security, compromise the freedom and safety of the transgender community. And likewise, let's also understand there are literally now, in the first 3 months of this year alone, 525 pieces of legislation introduced to reduce the rights to free access to a safe and legal abortion. In fact, just to abolish Roe v. Wade. So our freedoms, our rights, whether it's voting rights, whether it's the rights of the LGBTQ plus community, the rights of women seeking reproductive rights and abortion rights, our rights are being attacked on every level in state governments. It makes the role of Congress even more defining and more important than ever.
So let me ask you this, because there seems to be a consensus, which consensus sometimes is not correct. The conventional wisdom is that Republicans are going to win the House. The House Speaker will be Kevin McCarthy. So let's take a look at who that Congress is. After January 6th, 2/3 of the Republicans in the House that you're running for voted not to certify the election of Joe Biden as president. So how do you work, regardless of who wins the majority? Obviously, there's a lot more clout if the Democrats do. How do you work with the other side when you're confronted with a party that would not certify an election that was clearly won by Joe Biden.
Even worse than that, how do you work with a party that tried to cover up the January 6th domestic terrorist attack on the nation's capital? Try to cover up the investigation, try to stonewall it. There's no question. There are challenges that are daunting to our democracy, daunting to our freedom as a society. No question about it. But even in those types of severe, extreme situations, we have to look for ways to find common ground on important issues. You know, just take a look at the infrastructure legislation and what it represents. The infrastructure bill is so critical, the largest bill since the Eisenhower administration, because it's the first and most important tool we can use to protect ourselves from the climate crisis, protect ourselves from a threat to the climate, the possible destruction of our planet through what we're seeing is growing, increasing, dangerous weather patterns caused greatly through the misuse and abuse of citizens, of businesses, of corporations. And so the reality is, you know, whether you're living in a Republican congressional district or a Democratic congressional district, you have families every day that are at risk or in fact losing their homes, losing some cases tragically their lives because of the climate crisis. That has to be a common ground to bring people together. You know, in this congressional district alone, Steve, our congressional district, which runs from the North Shore of Suffolk and Nassau County through Queens, the Bronx, and Westchester, we saw in Queens 11 lives lost after Hurricane Ida, people living in substandard apartments who died in the floods. In Mamaroneck, in the village of Mamaroneck in Washingtonville, people starting back in their homes. We saw on the North Shore of Long Island severe flooding. People lost their homes, lost property, and were impacted. So all I'm saying is you have an opportunity through some of these issues to build common ground. Gun violence is not restricted to Republican areas and Democratic areas.
But Republicans have opposed this, and they have been much more, Republicans generally are much more disciplined in staking out. If you look at the January 6th committee, only 2 Republicans out of the entire House
That's right.
willing to participate in a serious way. There were a few other people that I think were there, wanted to troll the organization, but you only had 2 people. And for that, Liz Cheney, who voted Donald Trump 95% of the time, they want to throw out of the caucus. So the question is,
and Adam Kinzinger is not running again for re-election. He's just bailing out. I don't blame him.
well, do you work with them, or do you try to overcome them? I just, one thing that I have seen, if I can just add, is Republicans seem to do a better job messaging. And it seems that Democrats can have some strong points, but they don't make them effectively.
There are 2 questions you're asking, and I think just take one at a time. First and foremost, how do you work with this type of Republican Congress? And I would say to you, as horrific as their complicity in overturning our democracy, and that's just what it was, we have to find ways to build common ground to get things done, to get work done. And we've seen that happen before. For example, the Long Island Sound Watershed Reauthorization Act is up for renewal next year. That's critical, providing needed funds to make sure that we can protect our Long Island Sound, continue the cleanup programs that have been so impactful and so effective. And that's always been a traditional bipartisan mission. And frankly, and I believe it will be going forward, because we have to work together as Republicans and Democrats to protect the Long Island Sound. 10% of our nation's population is within 50 miles of the Long Island Sound. We call it America's Long Island's National Park, but it's essential to our region. It's essential to the future of our region. So we have to make sure our water quality is protected. We have to make sure the sound, the restoration of the sound, that it's not victimized by nitrogen going into the sound. We've got to make sure our sewage treatment plants are in fact retrofitted and upgraded, so we're not endangering the sound and the water quality. The point I'm making is we've always had strong bipartisanship to get that done. I believe that will continue. You saw bipartisanship emerge regarding the Northport VA facility when the Veterans Administration, in one of their recent studies, proposed scaling it back and shutting down many of its essential services. Now, we have on Long Island over 100,000 veterans, and this VA facility is the only VA facility on Long Island. You saw bipartisanship emerge there. And I think it's my job, if I'm given the privilege to serve as a Democrat in Congress, to find those issues when there can be bipartisanship, to protect the Sound, to, in fact, protect the Northport VA facility, or for that matter, to find common ground with many members of Congress who find their communities are victimized by the climate crisis, where they're in fact confronted with severe dangers that come through tornadoes or hurricanes or severe weather patterns. So there may be ways to build common ground, but I'll tell you something else, Steve. The White House gives you certain leverage for the next 2 years. We have to take advantage of and be aggressive with. And we also have to make sure that if Republicans don't see the light, we have to make sure they feel the heat. And that's part of the job of a Democrat in Congress, to stand up there, be an aggressive advocate, and hold people accountable through the hearing process whenever possible. And that's an underutilized tool, through congressional oversight, which is essential. And quite frankly, as you said before, through very disciplined and very clear and defined messaging.
Nassau County, recent elections, they were congressional, but we've had elections in Nassau County in November.
Mhm.
Republicans swept county executive, all 4 countywide seats.
I heard the rumor. Yes, I heard the rumor.
They gained a seat in the legislature, in the county legislature.
Sure.
They even won the town of North Hempstead for the first time in 30 years or so.
Right.
What do you feel is the reason? Why did Democrats do so poorly in a county where registered Democrats outnumber registered Republicans by 100,000 now?
And especially, and I think it's important to point out, with elected officials who are held in very high regard. People like Laura Kern, very respected as a county executive for her accomplishments and achievements. But nevertheless, there was Tim Senian, the Suffolk DA. There was a Republican tidal wave here. And in the Queens and Bronx part of our congressional district, it's important to remember those areas voted for Curtis Sliwa over Eric Adams for mayor. Can you imagine anyone voting for Curtis Sliwa for anything? I mean, it's almost an absurdity. But when you look at that kind of tidal wave, and remember, that's 81% of our district. You're making a very important point here, Steve, because while the good news is we can win this Democratic seat, the bad news is too many Democrats think we've already won it. And I would be very careful to remember 81% of this congressional district, the Bronx, Queens, and Long Island, voted Republican in significant numbers last year. Why did they do it, Steve? They did it because, in my view, people don't feel safe and they don't feel they're being listened to. This election had nothing to do with Laura Curran, nothing to do with, even for that matter, the town of North Hempstead. The Republicans ran people who didn't even campaign. They didn't even send their resumes out. It had to do with the fact that I think people were frustrated with Washington, not seeing fast enough action. I think they were dealing with the trauma, understandably so, of what the COVID pandemic represented, feeling insecure about their children, about the safety and health of their children, about their job security, about how to navigate working from home and caring for their kids. And I think there were a lot of, and also, of course, you can't ignore the issue of crime.
Well, let me ask you, we can talk about crime, but what about bail reform? Because
that's tied into it.
That has been now used very effectively by Republicans, have blamed the increase in crime in Nassau, in New York State and New York City on the bail reforms that were approved by the Democratic legislature.
Absolutely.
Controlled legislature. Do you think, now they were very effective in that. Were they correct? Do you think it was bail reform, or what do you account for that increase in crime, and how would you approach it?
Look, there are many reasons for the increase of crime. Democrats spend too much time focusing on the root causes of crime and not understanding the reality of crime today. Obviously, in a climate where 23 million people lost their jobs nationwide and lost their health care, you're going to have serious issues and mental health issues unattended. You're going to have, in a very frighteningly depressed economy, more crime. When you have guns flooding our streets, illegal guns flooding our streets, you're going to have more crime. There are many reasons for crime, without question. But the bail reform law was poorly done. It was, now, in fairness, no one should have to stay in jail because they committed the crime of being poor. Obviously, I speak to many police officers, and many people in law enforcement, they recognize that bail reforms had to be made. But the way it was done, I think, by the state legislature was counterproductive and ultimately ineffective. I think judges have to be given more discretion in terms of determining who may be a danger to society. I think there has to be standards for when judges feel individuals should be detained. If one is committing a hate crime, they shouldn't be given an appearance ticket. If individuals are in fact a potential risk to society, they shouldn't be given the idea of being able to walk out with any accountability. And just the judge shouldn't have his hands tied or her hands tied from holding these people accountable. So there's no question, while it's not a federal issue, you have to recognize not just that the Republicans were good at messaging, but Democrats had to do a much better job in implementing bail reform. I think Governor Hochul's initiatives were important in terms of bringing some sense of balance, giving judges more discretion. I think that's essential, making sure there's certain crimes where bail or other types of accountability in the legal system has to be put in place. So I think that is important. So there's some balance there, but there's no question the way bail reform was implemented, I think didn't in many respects contribute to the increase of crime, and it certainly contributed to the increase in fear and insecurity people feel. And we also can't ignore the impact of hate crimes and what that has meant. I have worked with so many people in the Asian American Pacific Island community who truly are afraid to stand on the subway platform, feel they're going to be a target. We've seen a growth of hate crimes confronting the Chinese, Korean, Asian American community at a record level. We've seen increased levels of attacks on the Islamic community, in the Muslim community, and certainly in the Jewish community. It's all well documented. And so we have to understand that's part of the issues of crimes that we have to address to make a safer society. I mean, when the FBI says white supremacy is the #1 domestic terror threat in our country, we know we have an issue to deal with. That's why I'm very proudly supporting Grace Meng's initiatives to make sure there's much more aggressive federal reporting of these crimes throughout the nation. And the police are given tools to be able to, in fact, deal with hate crimes more effectively, better training, more tools to deal with these issues. And likewise, I think education's a critical component. We should be teaching about Asian American history in our schools, teaching about the Holocaust and what it represents in our schools, teaching about the great contributions of the Muslim community in our schools, so that people stop being the other and we all become one. We can all respect each other's great contributions. Same way we teach Black history and women's history every Women's History Month. We only learn and grow as a society when we can benefit from learning and appreciating each other's history.
So let me ask you another question about the other thing that was unsaid by Democrats, and it wasn't, their defense of it was really not much of a defense other than Mr. Kaminsky's defense of his role in the legislature. But the other thing that was unsaid and unmentioned that seems strange is the fact that Donald Trump's name never came up.
Regarding what?
What's that?
Regarding what?
Well, regarding the fact that Bruce Blakeman, who's running for county executive, had been the Republican Party's liaison to the Trump campaign, and he expressed strong views in favor of Trump. Now, this may be something that's very attractive to Republicans and would make sense for him, and I think people recognized his role in the Trump campaign, but that would motivate Democrats to come out. And there were a lot of people that did not come out in the race, and that was sort of an opportunity for the Democrats to go on offense. Throughout the race, they were on defense about bail reform, about assessment. Why not use Donald Trump and the advocacy of people for him as a tool in that campaign? And I guess my question is, and this goes back to the question of the messaging, of whether Democrats, are not as my feeling is that Democrats are not as effective in the messaging.
You mentioned before, I've done a lot of cable news over the years on CNN, Fox, and MSNBC. And when you catch Republicans in a scam or a lie, they don't blink. They just keep going on. When you get Democrats put on the defensive, they go into group therapy. They start saying they didn't do it. They'll never say it again. They didn't.
Why didn't Laura Curran? Why didn't anybody go after Bruce Blakeman for his support of Donald Trump, which would have appealed to Democratic voters?
Let me tell you something. Laura Curran had a great record as county executive, and she served very well. There were a lot of issues that contributed to her really very sad loss. But in fact, you have to look at what was happening out of Washington. I think the Biden administration did a much more effective job in articulating their message of their accomplishments, which are real and substantive. I think you can look at a lot of issues that could be addressed in terms of what the state legislature did and the way they poorly implemented bail reform and the consequences to that. And the fact that Democrats have been speaking out much more aggressively on the issue of standing up basically against the root causes of crime, ways to deal with gun safety and get guns off our streets. There are many issues here. But I think the bigger point to me is that Democrats have to remind the public what it means next year in this year's congressional election, what it means if Kevin McCarthy becomes Speaker of the House, if Marjorie Taylor Greene has a gavel as a committee chair, if you empower these individuals who have engaged in the worst kinds of hateful, bigoted rhetoric, who've engaged in acts against our democracy, efforts to undermine, if not really destroy the right to vote for so many Americans. Democrats have got to focus on what the Trump legacy represents and why we can't let it happen again in the midterm election or in the presidential election. That's where the focus has got to be. And I think that's really, and by the way, let me tell you something. One thing I've learned from being in communications for so long and being on the air is Republicans are not going to put me on the defensive. No one's going to call me a socialist. I built a business and owned it and run it with two great business partners, Ron Edelson and David Chauvin, for 33 years. Not easy to keep a business going for that long, but no one's going to claim I'm a socialist. No one's ever going to attack me as being part of the defund the police movement. I proudly stand up for our police and believe it's perfectly consistent to talk about ways to improve police training, community policing, race relations with police, and still be for your police. So I think I can only speak for myself, but I can tell you this. When it comes to messaging, I know what I stand for. I know what I believe in. I know how Republicans have compromised and threatened our safety and security. And you can just start, Steve, by talking about the SALT deduction. Think about what Donald Trump did to middle-class families throughout the 3rd Congressional District, from Westchester through Long Island, when he took away the state and local tax deduction. It was a travesty. It was a partisan political hit job on middle-class Long Islanders and middle-class New Yorkers.
There's been analysis of the SALT tax that shows that the average people making $100,000 to $200,000 are only going to save $130. That the real savings is going to go to people who make more than that, or making $4 or $5 or $1 million.
Mm-hmm.
Is that true? Because I don't think those are not middle-class people.
You know something? When you get right down to it, the SALT tax is an unfair tax. Taking it away is unfair. The SALT tax is the oldest tax in our federal government, allowing to deduct state and local taxes. So if you realize that it was unfair that it be done, whatever level of the economic spectrum benefits is not the point. The point is it's only right and just to restore it. And I think that's critical. It's really taking it away is like a double taxation. So I would frankly feel that it's unfair. It's wrong that it was reduced. And yes, there are people on the wealthier end of the spectrum might benefit more, but everyone will benefit at some level. And it's just the right thing to do.
Would you want to reverse the tax cuts that were done during the Trump administration?
Oh, there's no question. The tax cuts to the very wealthy was an obscene giveaway. The Republicans promised the bill was going to pay for itself. Remember that? And of course it didn't. It just increased our deficit to record numbers under the Trump. Here was a strong economy, yet Donald Trump still increased the deficit to record numbers through the Trump tax deduction. And so, yes, the tax deductions that went to the most wealthy certainly should be stripped away.
In terms of accomplishments for Democrats, and they're kind of not heard, but you had the American Rescue Plan,
mm-hmm.
the infrastructure bill,
right?
American Rescue, where our GDP has increased at a 4 or 5% in the past year. Infrastructure bill. The first 12 months of the Biden administration, 6.6 million jobs were added, by far the strongest record of any president. Mm-hmm. Unemployment's at 3.6%. But I just saw a poll that said that only 28% of the American public believes that unemployment has come down during Biden's administration. How do you explain that? And what is that a failure of? And who is that a failure of?
Well, there's more than just a communications issue here, Steve. And that is, to me, yes, we are seeing historic job growth without question. 11 consecutive months of private sector job growth. We're seeing also a strong economy. We're seeing wages up. We're also seeing inflation at a 40-year high. That's cutting into any wage increase that people are feeling. We're also feeling people's insecurity, because it's not just gas at the pump that's going up. It's what people are paying for in the supermarket that's climbing. It's eggs and meat and milk. Basic costs are going up. It's impact. You see the supply line. Part of the problem is, Steve, we came roaring out of this pandemic, and there was enormous demand. People had savings to spend, but they didn't have the goods to spend on it. Goods were limited because of the supply line. So prices went up and dramatically went up. And there have to be steps, and I think the administration is starting to take some steps. I think they can be more proactive in dealing with it. Quite frankly, there are a lot of steps they could put in place to deal with the economic crisis. Obviously, the gas tax, a holiday on the gas tax is one step that can be taken in the short term. The Biden administration, in my view, should cancel student loan debt automatically at $50,000. That should be a minimum they cancel student loan debt at, because it's hurting the economy for so many young families trying to buy homes, start jobs. Likewise, I think, quite frankly, interest should not be paid on student loans. I mean, as I've gone door to door through this district, I've met families where students are paying 11%, 7% interest on student loan debts, and those predatory lenders should be prosecuted by the Department of Justice. So there are steps there, and I think, frankly, anyone earning under $250,000 should have their entire student loan debt. If you're earning over $250,000, I think you can work out some payment plan. I think that's something that can be done to help create some economic relief, and it would also be a boost to the economy. I mean, to the Biden administration's credit, they did try to push very hard through important initiatives like universal child care and universal elder care. And that would, universal child care would put 2 million more women back in the workforce and would be an important economic advantage besides being the right thing to do. And so I think there are many initiatives they've tried to pursue and build back better that have not succeeded. Hopefully they can come back with a smaller version and get it done. But you can't discount also the achievements that put in place with the infrastructure bill, the fact that 400 million Americans have shots in their arms now. There have been a lot of steps taken to move forward to bring us out of this difficult situation.
So in terms of inflation and rising prices, in terms of the response, there have been people who said the Federal Reserve was too slow in responding, that they bear more responsibility. The Biden administration bears some. COVID, the economy doing well. Also, the fact that wages are going up. Well, that increased costs when wages go up, or at least they can do it. And there's some who are saying there are some companies that are just using it as a convenient time to raise prices and make more money, and it doesn't tie to it, and other people supply. How do you parse that out in terms of responsibilities?
Look, in the long term, the infrastructure.
Does it matter when you're running for office, or is everything on what the Biden administration does or doesn't do?
No, I think it's about the initiatives we suggest as candidates for Congress, the initiatives we put forward as members of Congress. For example, in the long term, the infrastructure legislation will provide real opportunities to rebuild our economy, besides putting many needed services in place to improve our environment, stand up to deal with the climate crisis, repairing our roads, our bridges, our tunnels, expanding broadband. There are a lot of initiatives in the infrastructure bill that will be important in the long term. Likewise, and I've called for this as a candidate for Congress, I want a Marshall Plan to develop clean energy union jobs. In the same way we saw in the Truman administration, Secretary of State Marshall rebuilt Western Europe after the war. It was one of the great accomplishments of a country for the world, where the United States rebuilt Western Europe. There should be a Marshall Plan so that in every part of our nation, we see initiatives put in place for hydro, solar, turbo power. There should be a whole range of initiatives put in place to create renewables being built to take us to really finally get us off of fossil fuel economy, fossil fuel energy agenda. And let's remember, it's not just because it's good for the climate, it's also a matter of national security. We're seeing what's happening now in the tragedy of Ukraine. And that's a very clear message of why we have to move away from a fossil fuel economy and a fossil fuel energy policy. So I think that's in the long term initiatives can be put in place. In the short term, Steve, we got to raise revenue. Larry Summers, who's been a really an inflation hawk, and not exactly the most fun guy to hang out with, but he has been on target in terms of predicting these trends, has made the point we have to raise revenue.
So how do you recommend raising revenue?
Well, first step is these American corporations that are hiding their revenues in Ireland and in the Cayman Islands, that's got to stop. And they've got to be held accountable and brought back in. Corporations have got to pay a minimum tax. The idea that Amazon pays no tax is unacceptable. We have to make sure that the top tier earners in our country are paying a little bit more, that we raise the corporate tax rate. I know the Republicans will jump on this. They did. Remember when President Obama put in really modest adjustments to the tax rate and raised corporate taxes, and they claimed it was going to destroy the economy? It produced one of the largest times we had private sector job growth, and it brought down the deficit. They said the same thing about Bill Clinton. One of the best economies in our nation's history. So I think we have to just keep focused on the fact we have to protect the middle class and focus on targeting corporations that are just basically using loopholes to avoid paying their taxes, and go after corporate taxes and raise them. I'm not talking about an extraordinary raise them 3 or 4%, and focus on those certainly in the income of $10 million or more can certainly afford to pay more. And we're talking about a modest, maybe 2% more, but that would all contribute to helping us address inflation and trying to continue to bring the deficit down.
How do you explain the fact, particularly as Democrats, that this system, and you've had Democratic control, you had Obama in his first 2 years, and now Biden in his first 2 years with controlled everything, and you still have this type of tax system where you have Amazon, a company like Amazon pays nothing, where 50 companies that are your largest companies are not paying any taxes. And you also have the very, very wealthy who don't make their income with salary, also not contributing in terms of taxes over there. How does that exist? How come that is there when there was an opportunity to do it? Is that something that right now the Democratic majority hasn't done anything?
I would say this to you. I'm not here to defend the Democratic majority when I think they're wrong, and there's no question they have to be much more aggressive in addressing these issues. I'd much rather think about what the Trump majority represented when he was president with the Republican Congress, the kind of havoc they caused with the Trump tax cut plan and the kind of crazy out of control deficits they created, and Biden's bringing those deficits down. So there's no question, the real issue here is in fact what members of Congress are going to do to try to change that course of pattern. There's absolutely no excuse for the fact that companies like Amazon are not paying taxes, and it's a bipartisan disgrace. And we've got to demand that both parties take more aggressive action. And I know that the typical political game is you blame it on lobbyists. They're always the ones to blame. And yes, lobbyists in many ways are out of control. Frankly, the campaign finance system is more the problem. The idea that members of Congress are bankrolling their campaigns from the very industries they have to oversee and regulate. That is, I think, a fatal flaw in our democracy. That's why I've pledged, Steve, in my campaign that I will not take corporate taxes. I will not take corporate PAC money. Not everybody running for Congress in the 3rd Congressional District has taken that pledge. But I'm not going to accept political action committee money. And I'm going to go out there and raise money from individual citizens, and raise money and build support from non-corporate PACs. I think that's very important. So I think one of the ways you try to address this is reform the way we finance our campaigns. That I think is absolutely imperative. And also holding members of Congress accountable. When I look at these issues, Steve, the question becomes, where's the public outcry on this particular issue of tax inequity and tax unfairness? And where's the public outcry on so many other issues? We have 90% of America believes that we have to have much greater gun oversight over gun safety and anti-gun violence legislation. stronger background checks, getting rid of ghost guns, for example, putting red flags laws in place nationwide, banning the assault weapon ban, right down the list. There's broad national consensus. Why isn't there action in Congress? And I think you have to look at the role of money in politics.
Why does Medicare, why does not Medicare have the ability to negotiate drug prices with drug companies the way every other country in the world does?
Follow the money. Look at the donations of the pharmaceutical industries. That's something that should concern us. And also, we need to have a cohesive civic activism. We have to have a cohesive national outcry over these issues.
But how are you gonna, I mean, those are major issues. I mean, the idea, here we are in the midst of crime.
Mhm.
And we know that during the 2 years of COVID, gun sales skyrocketed.
Mhm.
We know the impact of having inadequate medical care, just diabetes. There was, the Biden administration has proposed a cap of $35 a month for insulin for diabetics, which when you're diabetic and you don't get insulin, there are all sorts of big medical problems that'll come. I mean, you save a lot of money by having people take insulin who need it.
Right.
How does that, I haven't even seen approval for that. How is that not passed yesterday? Where you have an epidemic of diabetes and all the problems that come with that.
No, there's no question. What you're pointing out is absolutely true. And we have to hold both parties accountable. Look, I'm proud to be a Democrat, and I'm running on very deeply held convictions and positions. I'm not going to Congress just for the purpose of working my way up the ladder, or because I need a job, or because I'm moving up the chairs. I'm going to Congress for public service. After my life in business, after my life in volunteer activism locally and around the country, I'm going to Congress to serve because I believe this is the most critical time to stand up for these very issues you're talking about, whether it's to protect our democracy or to make sure we can guarantee healthcare for every American, which I think is an absolute right we have to meet, an obligation we have to meet as a country, whether it's a commitment to bring down the cost of pharmaceutical drugs. So those are the missions that bring me there. And frankly, we have a system that has failed us in many respects, and we have to address it. This is not new, but I think we can put together a critical mass of activism and energy to try to address it. And I would also point out to you, Steve, listen to your talk. You think we just lock the door in the Capitol and go home and call it a day. Let's not forget the extraordinary achievements that have been made by our country, the great accomplishments made through Medicare, through the Affordable Care Act, the great accomplishments we've made through infrastructure over the years, the fact that American businesses saved the world with their vaccines during the pandemic. So we're a country that can accomplish great things. One of my concerns is people have lost faith in it. They lost faith in that we'll even have a democracy in 10 years. So I think we have to restore that sense of hope and optimism and trust in our nation. And I think it begins with the American people, the people listening here, people in our congressional district, voting on these issues, speaking up and demanding action on these issues. That's where it begins. And when that does happen, you see our Congress take action. You see assault weapons ban that was adopted years ago, the Brady bill that was put in place for background checks. You've seen initiatives move forward and take place. And you have great leaders, both in civic life and great leaders in Congress that I have confidence will carry that message, and I want to be part of that movement.
Well, let me ask you this, because you are a candidate. There are a couple of candidates. There's several candidates that already hold elective office.
Right.
You're running. You're one of the only candidates that has not held office before.
That's right.
So,
that's one of my best qualifications.
Is that something though that's necessary? You take somebody. John Kamen is one of your opponents. He's been a town supervisor and a deputy county supervisor and a judge and those other roles.
Absolutely.
You haven't served. So how does that, is that not an important ingredient in dealing with the different levels of government and making things positive happen?
Look, I respect everyone's service, be it as private citizens or in government on different levels. But I don't accept the conventional thinking that you had to be in local government to be able to serve in Congress. I don't think it's been an effect. I don't think we've seen evidence where that's been all that an effective training, an effective mission to be able to serve effectively in Congress. Just because you've held local office, just because you've held government appointments, doesn't necessarily give you the credentials or the vision or the experience to, in fact, emerge as an effective candidate or an effective member of Congress. And I think, very frankly, I think my activism as a citizen, my advocacy nationally, my experience running a business and building a business over 33 years are very important credentials for serving in Congress. It gives you a perspective that people who have been government bureaucrats or local politicians don't necessarily have. And I think the success of our campaign so far reflects that. You ask, is it a credential? Is it an essential credential to have a local political position before you can run for Congress? The fact is that throughout this congressional district, I have major endorsements from public officials in every county of this congressional district. No other candidate can say that. I've been endorsed by grassroots activists and political organizations in every part of this congressional district. No other candidate can say that. When it came to petitioning to get on the ballot, we didn't have to pay people to carry petitions. We had volunteers, and we were the only campaign that had petition carriers in every part of this congressional district, in every county, for that matter. And I'm proud to announce that when the first quarter ended, March 31st, I was only a candidate for 10 weeks, and I raised over $900,000, one of the top dollar figures in the country. And I did that without taking corporate political action committee money. And those experienced politicians who are running, many of them are taking corporate PAC money.
What do you attribute that? What do you attribute those endorsements and that support to?
It's interesting. I think because I've worked with these folks on many key issues. Nancy Seligson, who's the former town supervisor in Mamaroneck. She's one of the great leaders in terms of initiatives to protect the Long Island Sound. And she and I share a common commitment there, and she respected my experience and my knowledge. Jane Elkanini, who's the present supervisor in Mamaroneck. She endorsed my candidacy in Westchester. Now, in fact, she endorsed my candidacy because she felt we had common knowledge and understanding of what the role of Congress is. And look, throughout the rest of this district, having the endorsement of Greg Meeks, the chair of the House Foreign Relations Committee, one of the members of the House leadership, being endorsed by, and I won't go through the list, people can go to ZimmermanForCongress.com and see the list of members of Congress and former members of Congress, state legislators like Chuck Levine or Sandra Ung, city councilwoman in Queens, Ed Braunstein, Danny Rosenthal, assembly members. I won't go through the list. I don't leave anybody out. But folks who have been leaders in public policy, folks who have been held elective office, they know what it takes to win. They know what it takes to serve in Congress. And I'm very honored that they feel I have that support. I'd also include in that category civil rights leaders like Hazel Dukes and Tracy Edwards, for that matter, and Joanne Smith, who just retired as head of Planned Parenthood for Nassau County, who's been on the front lines protecting women's reproductive rights, abortion rights. She knows of my leadership and commitment, and she endorsed my candidacy.
Now, let me ask you.
So that answer your question, the folks who serve in public office, the folks who are in the front lines of major policy issues, they feel that I have what it takes to win this election, the knowledge, the experience, and the political skill, but they also feel I have the skill to serve. And that's just as important, if not more so.
You're running, and you've been, it's something that you've promoted, the fact that you're a gay candidate who's running. At the same time, you're running at a time when the a faction of the Republicans are running on the culture wars. They're running on critical race theory. They're running on defund the police. They're running on don't say gay in places. They're running against gay civil rights and things like that. So putting yourself in perspective, is that a plus, a minus, or just something that's there? How do you, I guess you would be more likely to be encountering opposition from this point. So how do you reckon, number one, the support and the fact that you're promoting this, the importance of that, and also the fact of the incoming fire that you could expect in a general election?
It's funny, Steve. It's not that I'm promoting that I'm gay. it's part of who I am. And I'm proud of it. And I talk about the fact that growing up as I did in the 70s, and it was a difficult time. It was a frightening time to be a kid in the suburbs in the 70s. Frankly, I was advised to look at conversion therapy as the answer. I used to hang out at the Seven Seas Diner in Greatneck because I was afraid to admit I didn't have a date for the dance. It was an isolating time, but it also became a very empowering lesson for me in terms of helping me find my voice. So I think that life experience has been part of who I am, part of my story, and I'm proud to say it. And let me tell you something. I'm someone who's proud to say gay. And based upon the support I've received throughout this congressional district from so many great people who've been role models and examples, just in North Hempstead, Supervisor Judy Bosworth, Councilwoman Lee Seaman, Councilwoman Veronica Lurvy, Councilman Peter Zuckerman, just my hometown, the way all the Democratic leaders in Greatneck have stood up for me. It just reflects what I'm feeling throughout the entire congressional district, that they're proud to say gay too. And we're not going to go back in the closet, either personally or be afraid to articulate the pride in respecting people of different backgrounds and sexual orientations, or not be afraid to celebrate different races and genders and the like, and celebrate our different religions. So I think it's a very empowering time to stand up for America. And you're right, Steve, when you say you're seeing the Republicans engage in wedge issues, the Don't Say Gay bills, the bills to abolish essentially Roe v. Wade, the bills to take away our voting rights. But it also is a very unifying time because we know we're all in this together. We're all part of one community. Whether you're gay or straight, we always need the right to vote. We all know it's important to respect women's rights to have their own determination over their own bodies. We all know we have to respect and stand up for each other based upon race, religion, or gender or sexual orientation. So
you're proud of that, but at the same time, there's probably been no greater time of a rollback of those rights, abortion rights, gay rights, at least in recent times, that we've seen in the country. So what is going to be, number one, do you think in a general election, in a Democratic primary, you've mentioned all Democrats who are backing you, what role do you see this defense of
something?
Gay rights and that in the general election?
You know something? I can't speak to the country, but I can tell you this. I know this congressional district very well. I am I'm very confident that this is a congressional district that's going to stand up with me and stand up in my campaign, because there's a greater sense of decency and fairness here that I think people might give credit to. I must tell you, I have spoken in front of many groups through all 5 counties, Republicans and Democrats. I'm the only candidate running for Congress who's held community town forums, community meetings. I had my first one in Nassau County. My second one was yesterday in Queens. And we did something unique, Steve. Most people, the local politicians, they do what they call telephone town halls, where they can edit the calls, they can screen them. We just invited people to come. And it was me with a mic. The first one, Gary Ackerman was there. The second one, Ed Braunstein was there. And we just took questions from the audience. And they were important, thoughtful questions. And I felt people were talking to me and respecting me as a peer, as a candidate for Congress. So I have every confidence that the fact that I'm a gay man is not going to be a liability. In the 3rd Congressional District, and I think in many places in our country, we've grown beyond the kind of hateful prejudice that we see from local Republican politicians. So I'm not afraid of that. And frankly, that is not, when I confront that, it empowers me even more to run and stand up stronger as a Democrat, stand up stronger as a citizen, stand up stronger as a gay man.
Ukraine, we haven't touched on that, and that is the other major story. So there is number one, how do you feel that the Biden administration has handled the crisis of Ukraine?
I have to tell you, in my discussions with foreign policy experts, so I've known in the previous administrations, they have a lot of respect for what President Biden and Secretary Blinken have done. And it's a very difficult challenge, because the president has to keep the European Union and NATO united in his initiatives. He can't just move off on his own. He's got to keep them united in focusing on ways to provide assistance to Ukraine. And the same way, he's also got to make sure that there's not a situation that could evolve where Vladimir Putin, out of panic or desperation, launches World War III. You're dealing with a very unstable actor that's well established, a very dangerously unstable actor. Now, we're not in the Situation Room, and I've not been briefed by the Joint Chiefs. I'm not in Congress yet, so I can't have that privilege of doing so. But he's, I think, done a very good job. Do I want to see more weapons there? Of course I do. But then it becomes issues of how you deliver the supplies. How can you do it? What will trigger perhaps Russia violating Article 5 of NATO and provoking a wider, more dangerous confrontation? Let's remember, they've got more nuclear weapons than any other country on the world stage. So I give the president and I give Secretary Blinken enormous credit for the way they are trying to play an important advisory role, both in assisting Ukraine and keeping the European Union and NATO united. And I have to say, the genocide we are witnessing, the war crimes we're witnessing, it's the most horrific situation since, of course, the Nazis marched in 1939.
Now, you use the word genocide, which is
quite deliberately
one of those words that have been controversial in terms of whether using. President Biden just used it. You agree with him?
Well, he didn't initially. I've been saying it for a while. Many other leaders in Congress have been saying it. Chuck Schumer has said it. I'm glad the president's saying it because the world has to know the war crimes and genocide that's being committed have to be documented for history, and it has to be documented out of respect for the tragedy of the lives lost, and also to galvanize the world to action. We can't cover up what's taking place there. And to the president's credit and Secretary Blinken's credit, they're making sure the world sees it. One of the most important initiatives they did in the beginning of this conflict was not allow Russia to engage in what they call a false flag operation. Russia would try to create a scenario by which they could trigger a war by releasing the intelligence in real time. It's never been done before. We saw front and center just how evil and deceitful Russia had been in their conduct. And we're seeing that now I'm calling it out as genocide as part of educating the world about why action has to be taken. So I think that's an important piece of this here. But going forward, I just say, my prayers, my commitment is with the Ukrainian people. I think I speak for so many who are watching tonight. I just look at what their heroism is almost biblical. It is biblical, the way they're standing up to this kind of assault. And whatever we can do through our volunteerism, through our donations, whatever our nation and the world can do by providing supplies and assistance for the Ukrainian people, for the millions who are refugee status, we have to do.
So let me ask you the question of refugees.
Mm-hmm.
We have said we'll accept 100,000.
Right.
This connects into our whole issue of immigration. But just for a moment, talk about Ukrainians. Poland has accepted 2.5 million.
Exactly.
Smaller countries around there, Poland, which has 40 million people, has accepted 2.5 million refugees. Moldova, these other countries that are smaller have accepted large numbers of refugees. Should we be accepting more than 100,000 refugees?
Of course we should. We should be setting an example for the world and taking in many more refugees. We have the capacity to do it. We have the ability to do it. We have an obligation to the world community to do it. Absolutely. I mean, parts of Poland, their cities are being overrun with trying to care for and take care of the refugees. It's an international crisis, and as leaders of the free world, we have to lead in that regard. And we should be taking in certainly way more refugees than 100,000.
So what happened with the Syrian refugees when the Assad was attacking with the support of the Russians? People cited security as a reason not to take in Syrian refugees they were using chemical warfare, and they were using the same tactics of bombing civilian targets.
And our response was not nearly aggressive enough to Assad in Syria. Let's be very clear, not nearly aggressive enough in response to Putin. One of the reasons Putin felt so empowered to be in Ukraine is because he was able to maneuver in Syria and maneuver in Chechnya the way he did.
So we should be taking in more. What about our immigration? You know, we're talking about the fact, I think there are 5 million unemployed people in the United States.
Mhm.
There are 11 million jobs.
Mhm.
And yet we don't have an immigration policy. We have a number of people who are in limbo, who've come from Mexico and Central America. And that include refugees. They may not be as terrible as Putin and what's going on there, but their lives are endangered by, you know, thugs in Central American countries. And yet we still have not come up with an immigration policy. What do you think should be done about immigration?
Well, the first step is we have to put in place a pathway for citizenship for the undocumented living in our country. There are 12 million living in our country, living in the shadows, afraid that if they get pulled over a broken taillight, they can be deported and their families can be divided. And these people are these undocumented citizens living in our country make an important contribution to our economy. They're part of our communities. They're part of our families at large. So we have an obligation. And by the way, I think it's worth pointing out, Steve, this issue of a pathway for citizenship for the undocumented used to be a bipartisan issue. Peter King was a strong advocate of it, for that matter, a very strong spokesperson for it. And we've got to get back to that mindset, because we have an obligation both to those living here as we do to the dreamers who are here and people here under temporary protection services, to make sure that they're not facing deportation or fear of being removed. I think we have to provide a pathway for citizenship for dreamers and people here under temporary protection services. And that is not a radical idea. It's a bipartisan idea. At one point, there were 68 votes in the US Senate to get that done. 68 votes. And the Freedom Caucus in the House, a caucus of 30 Republicans, killed it. So I think it's the first step that should be taken. And not everyone running in this election has been that clear or pronounced in advocating for that, but I will. Also, I think there's an obligation we have as a country to restart investing in the Northern Triangle countries in Central America. People are fleeing for their lives because of safety, because of starvation, because of the climate crisis and the fact that their homes have been destroyed, their lives have been destroyed through severe weather patterns. And so I think we have to reinvest, as we used to do, by the way, in the Northern Triangle countries, to try to give people a sense of safety staying at home. I think that's going to be very important. I think we also have to address our asylum situation. You know, it's interesting to note that neither Republicans or Democrats have tried to change our asylum laws. It's part of the fabric of our country. But the reality is there are over 1 million people applying for asylum, and our asylum courts are woefully understaffed. We need more asylum judges. We need to process asylum cases, either to grant them or not, in a much faster fashion. So that's got to be accelerated radically. That's got to be improved dramatically, so that people who are waiting know whether they're going to be granted asylum status in the United States or not. So that's got to be an important piece of it too. But we can do that. And of course, you know, to the Republicans who want to say that, well, that threatens border security, you can have border security and a sane, rational immigration policy. I mean, Democrats are the ones in 2007 who advocated building the fence along the Mexican border. That still stands. And we have to also have greater security in our ports, greater security in our airports. The amount of fentanyl coming in from China through our airports is a tremendous threat to our country. So we've got to keep a focus on border security. There's nothing inconsistent with advocating border security and talking about and advocating for a pathway for citizenship for the undocumented. It's all part of an action plan that we've got to put in place.
Trump brought down the legal immigration, not the illegal, the legal immigration, to about 30,000 people a year.
That's right.
I think Biden has increased it to 60,000.
Mm-hmm.
Is that enough?
You know, we have to look at the numbers. I can't give you a number off the top of my head. Got to evaluate it. I think clearly it's something, you know, what Trump did was bring down legal immigration with the worst kind of divisive, bigoted statements, statements that were so viciously anti people of Hispanic and Latino heritage, people who are from the Muslim community. And he did it in a way that was very divisive and you see the rise in hate crimes is no coincidence at the same time. So my point to you is, I think we have to look at those numbers and do an evaluation. I can't tell you what the proper number is, but I think we have to be open to the idea that, look, there's a lot of jobs unfilled in this country, and a lot of people are prepared to work. So we have to keep that in mind too. Both people want to come here as legal immigrants through temporary, people want to come here legally, who want to work hard, and many of them want to go home to their families. We have to be that mindful of the services they perform, as well as those in our country who also want to find ways to build their careers.
One final, second to last question for you. And if there's any other issues that you'd like to comment on, feel free if I've missed anything. But one issue is January 6th. We now have the Congress investigating. A lot of people are concerned, though, not to sound like the former president saying a lot of people, but there's been a lot of criticism of the Justice Department apparently not conducting a criminal investigation of what happened on January 6th and the involvement of not only extremist groups, but members of the Trump administration, as well as Congress. At the end of the day, does that have to happen if the rule of law is going to be respected in this country?
My very honest answer to you is, and it's not, I'll be very clear with you. We spent the past 4 years under the Trump presidency speaking out about the way he tried to use the Department of Justice as his own political tool, as a platform for revenge, as a platform for targeting his enemies. And so I think we have to be very careful as citizens to, and certainly public officials have to be particularly careful not to be in a position where they're trying to create a political climate where they're calling upon the Department of Justice to pursue prosecutions. We have to trust the independence of the Department of Justice. We have to respect that as an independent judiciary, an independent branch of government, and not make the mistakes that President Trump did and his administration did when they tried to use the Department of Justice, and the Department of Justice was all too willing to comply with engaging in becoming a political tool of the White House. So we've got to respect the independence of the Department of Justice. So I feel strongly about that. Is it frustrating that it's not moving faster?
Are you afraid that we're going to bend too far over and that we're not going to have justice, that we're going to want to avoid the politics? And in a case where there is an effort, a concerted plot to overturn the election, it sounds like something you'd get in the X-Files, starting at the highest levels of government. This is actually the highest level of government. It sounds conspiratorial, but all the evidence points that way. And Liz Cheney said the same thing.
Yes. Oh yeah.
And she's not exactly a leftist.
Look, do I personally want to see the Department of Justice moving faster, being more expeditious, and bringing people to justice for what was let's call it what it was. We called it insurrectionist act. It was a domestic terrorist attack that the president encouraged and inspired against our government to overturn the election. Let's just lay it out. Do I want to see the Department of Justice move more aggressively on this? Absolutely, I do. Is it appropriate for a public official, a member of Congress, or someone in the Biden administration to make that call? I would say probably not, because there shouldn't be political pressure on the Department of Justice. It should certainly be done, and their independence should happen quicker, but I want to see it happen faster. Yes. Their independence should be respected. I want to see them move faster if possible. And by the way, Steve, I want to congratulate Blank Slate Media and your editorials for holding everyone accountable on this issue and demanding action and demanding that people speak up. It's had quite an impact, and it's really been very significant. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you. I noticed I get all the emails. I'm blessed with that, of getting every candidate's email. That is the job. I did sign up for it, so I can't complain.
Right.
But I noticed today that you called for the impeachment of Clarence Thomas.
Oh, yes, I did. I did.
So tell me about that, because we mentioned not getting involved in the Justice Department, but your take
Impeachment
on
is
this, on where the Supreme Court is, and Clarence Thomas and his wife, Ginny.
right. And first of all, this is not compromising the Department of Justice or putting pressure on the Department of Justice. Impeachment is an act of Congress. And it's the role of Congress to pursue impeachment. It's a constitutional right, constitutional responsibility. And the idea that the United States Supreme Court justices do not have to meet this ethics standards that other justices have to meet is totally unacceptable. And Justice Thomas has recused himself from different cases in the past. But in a case where his wife was so intimately involved, the fact that he chose to stay in his position and not recuse himself is unconscionable. There are many other aspects of his career that are unconscionable, but this to me is an impeachable offense. He should resign or be impeached because of it. You're talking about the greatest crime against our democracy, probably since the Civil War. I've used that analogy often, but I think it's fair. The greatest crime against our democracy since the Civil War. And here was Justice Thomas's wife being one of the leading proponents of it. And he didn't recuse himself from the case. There's no excuse for it. It's time for him to be impeached. It's also time for the Supreme Court of the United States to meet the same ethics standards that every other judge has to meet.
The Supreme Court, and we talk about divisiveness, we talk about where we are, we talk about Roe v. Wade and where that is headed. Has that become a political institution? Are now justices, should there be an R and a D next to their names when they're doing decision? It appears that way, and a lot of people think so. Do you think we're at that point where the majority, and we'll leave out Justice Roberts, the other 5 who were appointed by Republicans?
I think it's so overtly political. And I think it actually began in the case of Bush v. Gore in 2000, when you saw 5 Republican justices literally stop the vote from being counted in Florida. First time it ever happened. First time a federal court ever, the US Supreme Court in particular, chose to interfere in the counting of an election results in Florida. And I think it began then. And I think it's only accelerated. In fact, Justice Alito speaking to the Federalist Society said to them, folks, the buffet is open, referring to all of the right-wing agenda that could be now heard before the court. So I think we have to be very mindful this court has lost its, a number of these members of the court have lost their judicial credibility and engaging in a very partisan fashion.
Now, do you think there's a role for Congress to play or the president to play in trying to rein that in? Are there reforms? Are there term limits? Are they increase the size of the court? There's been a number of proposals to change what could be a majority that'll go on for decades.
Yeah, one of the candidates in the race wants to increase the size of the court. I think that's very much a foolish idea, because then after Democrats get in and increase the size of the court, Republicans will increase the size of the court. And then it goes back and forth, and it ultimately destroys any credibility of the court. I think we could look at issues like putting in perhaps 30-year term limits for Supreme Court justices, as opposed to having life terms. You don't want them there. You don't want them there short enough where they're worried about their next job. But if they serve for 30 years, that might be long enough, certainly long enough for a career, and it provides a proper turnover. So that's something to consider. I think we also have to expand the federal bench dramatically. I think we need it to deal with the caseload. I think it would also restore some judicial balance. I think that's something we should look at as well. So there's steps that can be taken. But remember, the most important step, Steve, the most important step, and let's remember this, elections matter. Your vote matters. We see this crisis on the court, this partisanship on the court, because Donald Trump is president. And in fairness, we've never seen under Republican or Democratic presidents this kind of partisanship that Donald Trump put on the court. So it's a reminder that votes matter. And when you're voting for a president, you're also voting for the kind of Supreme Court you want.
Okay, we're a mere 10 minutes over our time. So
I'm just warming up.
I think I'm doing fabulous within 10 or 15 minutes of deadline. My final question for you is, why are you the best choice in this Democratic primary for the 3rd district?
I think I'm the best choice to serve in Congress for our congressional district based upon my life experiences, working on Capitol Hill, standing up to the right-wing demagoguery that we've seen as a strong national advocate, my activism locally, and also my career in business. It's all given me very unique and different perspectives that have enabled me to build the kind of broad coalition of support I have throughout this congressional district. I'm the only one who has strong endorsements from elected officials and political activists and policy leaders and organizations in each part of this congressional district. We've built a consensus, and that's, I think, what's very important. Let me stress this to everyone who's watching. This is a district we can easily lose. It's a district where 81% of it voted Republican last year. If we allow candidates to engage in demagogic and polarizing rhetoric from the right and the left, and that certainly could happen in this race with some of the people running. If we allow that to happen, we will lose any opportunity to show that we can lead and create thoughtful solutions for the future. It's important to build consensus in a district this diverse. And the fact that we have actually volunteers and organizations in every county of this congressional district engaged in working on the campaign, that we have endorsements and grassroots activists and political activists in every part of this district working here. And we're the only campaign that does, I think says a lot about the fact that we've been able to build a strong consensus, build on endorsements to build a great field organization, and in fact, show that we can, through our fundraising, which is certainly one of the top in the country, and through our organization that we've built throughout this district, show that we can actually not just win this district, but lead in this congressional district. If we allow one regional candidates to run and create that division, we'll lose in November. The nominee has to be a nominee who represents the entire district. That's what I'm doing. And I invite everyone to go to ZimmermanForCongress.com to read about our campaign, see our endorsements, and see the kind of grassroots activism and the grassroots energy we've created in all of the 5 counties of our congressional district. Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to thank Robert Zimmerman
Thank you.
for this important discussion, as well as those of you who attended and took part in this. I would like to again thank Northwell Health for sponsoring this evening's discussion and many others. For those who were unable to watch today, or those who would like to watch it again, a recording of our discussion can be found on Blank Slate Media's website, theisland360.com, our Facebook page, and on our YouTube channel. I invite everybody to sign up for our YouTube channel. You can see all the discussions that we have during this year on the congressional candidates. A story about this evening's event will also appear in the 6 Blank Slate Media newspapers next week. And we will continue our series next week as well over here. Again, I want to thank Robert for your participation and answering all our questions.
Thank you very much, Steve. To you, Blank Slate Media and Northwell. Thanks for this opportunity.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody.